So the first page we are going to fill out today is this one, the Nullification Crisis. So we're going to start up here in the, I'll put a little star by it, this box, and then we'll go from that box to over here and then follow the arrows. Okay, so I'm going to go through using this reading to help you guys fill out your page for your interactive notebook. So it says, this crisis erupted when Congress passed a law in 1828 raising the tariff on iron, textiles, and textiles are like your clothing goods, so cotton, fabrics, those types of things, and other products. This tariff, which tariff is a fancy word for tax, helped manufacturers in the North and some parts of the West. But it made Southerners pay for more manufactured goods. It seemed to Southerners that the federal government was forcing them to obey an unfair law. So in your first box that we start over here, it says what tensions were there between the North and the South before 1832. And so these tensions were based on this tariff. So the tension, and you guys can use bullet points in this box, but the tension between the two is based on the tariff. And that tariff helped manufacturers in the North and some parts of the West. So that made the Southerners mad because it made them pay more for manufactured goods. So I can even write that off to the side. So the North liked the tariffs because they made more money. So the North liked tariffs because it equaled more money. And then the South was forced to pay more. So they disliked it. So that would be your tension. So the South was forced to pay more. And just like last week, if you guys need to pause the video to fill out your interactive notebook, you guys can. Okay, so this would be your tension. So what I highlighted and wrote off to the side between the North and the South. So at the time, Vice President John C. Calhoun, he was from South Carolina, he argued that the states had the right of nullification. And what nullification means is it's an action by a state that cancels federal law to which the state objects. And so basically what that is that if a state says, I don't like this federal law, they don't have to follow it. So the Vice President of the United States was arguing that, you know what, if the South doesn't like this law, this tariff, we're just going to decide not to follow it. Okay? So he's saying, oh, we have the choice to pick and choose. So if accepted, Calhoun's idea would seriously weaken the federal government because basically the states would just pick and choose what laws to follow. So arguments for nullification. To many Southerners, the tariff or tax issue was part of a much larger problem. If the federal government could enforce what they considered an unjust law, could it also use its power to end slavery? So the South was afraid that if they could use power to force them to pay a tax they didn't want to, then they could also use their power to get rid of slavery, and the South didn't want that. So John C. Calhoun, the vice president, based his theory or his idea of nullification on his view of how the Union or the United States was formed. He said the Union grew from an agreement between the various states, and after the Union was formed, each state kept certain powers, and one of the powers states had was to nullify federal laws that the people of the state considered unfair. So he's trying to say, well, when we first created our country, states had the power to do this, so that means we still have the power to do that. The clearest argument against nullification came from Massachusetts Senator Daniel Webster. He argued that the United States had not been formed by the states, but by the entire American people. So in a dramatic speech on the floor of the Senate in January 1830, Webster defended his belief, saying, "We are all agents of the same supreme power, the people." A few months later, President Jackson dramatically defended the Union. At a banquet, Jackson stared directly at Vice President Calhoun and said, "Our federal union, it must be preserved. So he's basically telling his vice president, we cannot have states deciding what they're going to do on their own. Ominously, which means kind of ironically or weirdly, Calhoun responded, the Union, next to our liberty, the most dear. The challenge was clear. To Vice President Calhoun, states' rights, so their rights and what they're allowed to do, was more important than saving the United States or saving the Union. So we've already filled out this first box. So we're going down here to why did he issue the tariff of 1832? Because all of these arguments we just read about were before 1832. So it says, in 1832, Congress passed another tariff law. Although it lowered some tariffs, it passed high tariffs on iron and textiles. So they passed another tariff law, and it lowered some tariffs, and it passed high tariffs on iron and textiles. And the reason, I'm going to use a smaller size too. The reason they did this, the reason President Jackson did this was to lower some taxes to make the South happy. Yes, they made some tariffs higher, but they were hoping to lower some. It would make the South happy. So they lowered some taxes to make South happy. So that's why Andrew Jackson passed the tariff of 1832, was to try to appease or make them happen. Okay. So in your page, the next one, if we follow the arrow, says what was the crisis itself. So now we've passed this tariff to try to lower some tariffs for the South. However, South Carolina then called a state convention which voted to nullify the tariffs. So the tariffs of 1828 and 1832, it said, did not apply to South Carolina. The state also warned the federal government not to use force to impose the tariffs. So if it did, South Carolina would secede from the Union. So in that box it says, what was the crisis? So the crisis was that South Carolina said the tariffs of 1828 and 1832 did not apply to South Carolina. So that was the first part of the crisis. So that could be your first bullet point. The tariffs South Carolina said did not apply to them. And then they also said, a second bullet point was that they warned the federal government not to use force to impose them. And what that means is they basically said to the federal government, don't bring soldiers in here to try to force us to follow it. We're not going to do it. Because if you do, we are going to secede from the Union. So that could be your third bullet point. So they said, if you send soldiers in here to force us to follow this, we will secede. And secede means leave. So they're basically saying we would become our own country if you do that. Okay, so those should be 3 bullet points in that nullification crisis. South Carolina said the tariffs didn't apply to them because of nullifying them. They said don't use force to impose them, and if you do, we'll secede. So furious, President Jackson responded strongly. In December 1832, he put federal troops in South Carolina on alert. So he didn't say go invade, he just put them on alert. Then he issued a proclamation to the people of South Carolina. It said that the Union could not be dissolved. So basically saying the Union cannot be broken apart. It also warned that disunion by armed force is treason. And so he's basically saying if you fight the soldiers, that is seen as treason, which means going against your country. With tensions running high, Calhoun resigned as vice president. Early in 1833, Jackson asked Congress to allow the federal government to collect its tariff in South Carolina by force, if necessary. At the same time, he supported a compromise bill that would lower the tariffs. In March 1833, Congress passed both laws. So in that same box still where it says what was the crisis, there's 2 more bullet points. First is that in 1833, Jackson asked Congress to allow the government to collect its tariff by force. And then last bullet point is President Jackson supported a bill that lowered the tariffs. Okay, so that's kind of the end of the crisis. So President Jackson asked Congress to allow them to actually collect it by force, and at the same time, he passed a bill to lower the tariffs so that South Carolina would actually pay them. Okay, so that would be your what is the crisis. So the last one we have to fill out is what was the effect of the nullification crisis. So the last paragraph says, unable to win support for its position from other states, South Carolina then repealed or took away its tariff nullification. Many Americans breathed a sigh of relief. The crisis had been settled peacefully. So the effect would be that South Carolina repealed or took away the idea of nullifying the tariff. So they basically said, okay, we will follow the tariff. But then this battle over the idea of nullification would lead to, I can't write as fast as I talk. So this battle about nullification would lead other states to begin arguing. Would lead other states to begin arguing about their rights. Maybe if I can fit it in there. Arguing about their rights. And we'll see that argument about what rights states have in further events in your notebook. Okay, so again, the effect of the crisis, South Carolina repealed or took away its nullification, but then, so that's one bullet point, then the next one is that this battle overall would lead other states to begin arguing about their rights that they have as states over the federal government. And actually, you know what, I'll add that at the end, about their rights over the federal government. Okay, once you guys fill the nullification crisis out, you guys can go ahead and go on to the next one. There's kind of a web quest one for the Compromise of 1850.